Kicking off at 12 noon, high noon, it is Leeds versus St Helens. A repeat of last year's final. Not a good weekend for York, losing in the 1895 and the women's semi-finals. And we'll start with their game against St Helens first. And it is interesting how in her pre-match press, Lindsay Anfield did mention her and her side's records in big games. I'm sure there'll be a day when York win and then they'll go on and win everything for a while, but whether it's a psychological thing or just the fact that St Helens were better on the day, which is easier to describe them as. Saints at Wembley in the Women's Challenge Cup final. Couldn't have happened to a nicer player in Faye Gaskin as well with that drop goal. It was a cracking drop goal as well.
I think, again, you look at those moments that determine games, and York set up for what looked like a reasonable drop goal, which I think had they got it, the boot would have been truly on the other foot. And Tara Jane Stanley, who's kicking, is pretty fantastic, missed it. And, you know, that is fine margins when you come down to semi-finals. I think if there was, I don't like to use the word criticism, but if you were to look at their own performance, the one thing that they would identify even more than we would was at times, again, they looked to revert to being a side of talented individuals rather than a team. And you looked at Emily Rudge and Jodie Cunningham and the work that they were doing for the team. And that maybe was the difference. The squad at York, person on a team sheet, possibly were rightly deemed to be favourites in that game. But they didn't seem to be the same level of cohesion that St Helens had. And I think, again, you know, Lindsay Anfield might be able to point to other occasions in major finals where that has been their undoing. It's something that clearly they will work on a lot, they will look to address, but it had a familiarity as we went into those final stages that it was almost about the effort and ethic of St Helens getting them to the right part of the field rather than the individual brilliance among York, which didn't quite work for them.
And Saints were in that position themselves only a couple of years ago where they couldn't win the big games and Leeds would invariably go out and win them. And then they won one, and then they won a few for, you know, Challenge Cups and grand finals and such. But what a gaming prospect. I mean, you mentioned Emily Rudge and Jodie Cunningham, whose faces get battered every time they're on the telly, it seems. I remember Jodie Cunningham's black eyes at the World Cup, and both her and Emily Rudge sporting some extra furniture on their face by the end of the proceeding. What was that? That bandage on Grace Field's head as well. That was an interesting accoutrement in that York Saints game. And then they meet again this week on Friday night at the Totally Wicked Stadium. So a chance for York to get some measure of revenge, but it's not really, is it? Because that was the big chance of making history, of going to Wembley, first Challenge Cup final for the women's game, and they didn't win. So if they do win on Friday, it doesn't really mean much. I know that seems an odd thing to say about a league game where 2 points were at stake, but it doesn't mean as much as this did.
I didn't watch either of the two women's games other than for a few minutes of both games. And, you know, I thought generally the standard of the women's games looked to have got better. But there were a couple of things that I noticed. The drop goal, which was a fantastically well-struck drop goal. And, you know, in fairness to Schneider the week before, it wasn't the best drop goal. It certainly improved on Sunday, didn't it? But there was no kick pressure by York at all on that attempted drop goal, and the defence didn't look united. They looked tired, and at that moment, it's just a little bit of game awareness. And again, with Wigan, the latter stages of that game against Leeds, I think they had about 13 minutes to go. They conceded, and they didn't kick off short. Now in a cup semi-final with 13 minutes remaining, it's your last sort of ditch opportunity to get the ball back. And I think it's just those couple of moments for me where it's just about a little bit of greater awareness. And, you know, if you're coaching, it's about coaching process, which I know is a boring phrase and keeps getting banded about, but it was something that I used to say when I was coaching touch judges at Championship, is that let's not focus on decisions so much as focus on why we got something right or why we got something wrong. And I think that's what, you know, teams like York, with the with the ability of some of the players that they've got, that's perhaps some of the areas that they need to work on. It's not just that they perhaps froze on a big stage. It's some of those indicators along the way that make up what is a good team performance. And I think you're probably right. I mean, you watched the game far more intently than I did. That Saints perhaps showed that on that game.
Yeah, I think it is about a connectivity. And it's something that Lois Forsell was saying after Leeds' victory, is that whilst they were annoyed with themselves that they couldn't get further ahead, what they did do was believe in the process to the point where when they did score on the hour, that cracked the dam. And it wasn't as much that they defended brilliantly. Both teams did. And I think Wigan deserve an enormous amount of credit because they lost to the same opposition by 50 points 2 weeks ago. So to turn that around and be in the game for an hour was already enormously to their credit. But what Leeds did was just kept defending so doggedly that they knew that if a chance came, that they were in the perfect position to exploit it. And they didn't exploit it once with what was a brilliant try by Caitlin Beavers. They then scored straight away on the back of that. And that's what cracked the Wigan resistance. I think that we're set up for another amazing final, aren't we? And the stories in that, Amy Hardcastle moves from St Helens to Leeds and all of a sudden is playing St Helens at Wembley. And, again, it shows what it means to the players. She's been on every major stage in the women's game, including, being one of the players of the tournament in the World Cup. And yet was in tears in the press conference after it when it suddenly dawned on her that at the age of 34, she was going to be playing at Wembley. And I think that we've got two teams who won't be fazed by the occasion. They've been in enough major finals. They'll relish the fact that they are making history, but there's nothing between them. So again, don't treat it as a curtain raiser. Get there in time to see it because it's going to be astonishing. I think the other thing that was said afterwards, which was actually by Robert Hicks, which was really interesting when we were talking about what could we anticipate as a likely attendance. He said this will show the value of the women's game to the sport at the moment because you've got two teams who will only be there through their women's team. So how many St Helens and Leeds fans will actually go will be a measure of the value of the women's game at the moment. So again, to those teams, and I know certainly, I think both of them are putting on supporters, coaches and all that kind of thing. Please go, because if we are measuring the value of the sport, we're going to go into a TV negotiation wanting to know what our worth is when we speak to potential broadcasters. This is a great indication of it. And Robert was saying anything over 50,000 he thinks would be acceptable. And I was, of course, saying I think we can get 70, to which he said, you're absolutely mad. Never happen. And it probably won't. But if you're a neutral, 25 quid to see 3 games where you don't know who the winners are going to be, involving 6 different teams and all with great stories to tell. If you love rugby league, you have to go. You have to go. The game needs you to go because not only will you enjoy it and it'll be great value for money, but we'll be judged on this. And what we don't want to see is swathes of empty seats when people are sitting at home going, isn't the crowd terrible? Like, I know we're in a cost of living crisis, but if you can go, please go.
That's the key, isn't it? If you can go, if you have the means to go and you sit at home and moan about it, then you're part of the problem. I think the interesting thing for Wigan is the hope that they can keep as many of these young players at their club and they don't lose them to Saints or Leeds or York or whatever, so they can become, once again, a force in women's rugby league, because we saw them win that grand final a few years ago against Leeds. They obviously pushed Leeds close this week. They pushed York close in the semi-finals in the Super League last year. So they can be a team who challenges for honours in the very near future because they've got a clutch of very talented young players there.
I think the other interesting thing about St Helens and Leeds is they're going down that route as well of a lot of young players. So I don't think they necessarily would be in the market to take other teams' young players. Leeds have got a disciplinary issue coming up tomorrow where they've got 2, particularly Kira Bennett, an England international who may be ruled out of the final because they've only got 1 league game between now and Wembley, but they both got 2 match bans at the moment. So they'll appeal that. It'd be very interesting to see Normally players are not ruled out from playing at Wembley, and they clearly waited to appeal to know if they were going to be there, and now that they are. But again, there's good young players coming through at both Leeds and Saints at the moment, that they're building the next generation around. And looking at the halfbacks of Leeds and Wigan yesterday, they were all young players who look like they've got really big futures ahead of them.
Can they not invent a reserve game to get one of the games off?
I was just going to say that. Can they not arrange a warm up or friendly? Yeah.
Not sure that women's game. Oh. Yeah, we play Alton Raiders for
equality, Phil. Equality. That's what
Ryan.
It was we talk about stories, talk about Caitlin Beavers, right, coming back from injury and all that. But she's already performed at Wembley. She's already taken the whistle at Wembley in the schools final, which was made very little of at the time. So she's got that experience of performing at Wembley. Seems like the wrong phrase, but she didn't play at Wembley. She was the referee at Wembley. So it's interesting to see how that experience works for her, because she's the only one out there, I'm going to guess, who's played or been on the pitch at Wembley.
She did something that I never did. I never refereed at Wembley. So, yeah, and, officiated there a number of times on the line, video ref, but reserve referee, but never refereed at Wembley, unfortunately. Last year's final bid at Tottenham, so she's got that one on me, that's for sure.
I can't imagine there's anybody else in the history of the game that will have officiated a game at Wembley and then played a game at Wembley. That is a record.
No, probably not.
Will probably, well, it won't necessarily always be a record, but I can't see anybody maybe changing that unless a professional player suddenly becomes a referee, but not doing it the other way around.
The only one in sport I can think of, and it's not rugby league, is the great former England football international who also refereed and I believe won the FA Cup, the great Cigar Bastard, who's, I believe that's the pronunciation of his name. Yes, Cigar Bastard, middle name Richard, which some would say is pretty much the same thing. Played for England at football in 1880, played cricket for the MCC as well, and was also a referee. I believe he refereed an FA Cup final, but I can't read his Wikipedia page that quick. But I'm fairly sure he did.
That would be interesting.
That would be, yeah. The referees.
Well, that's apparently he is the inspiration for the chant. So, but I mean,
when I married Stephen, there was the prospect of whether I should take Stephen's surname, and Stephen's surname is Wright. And I thought, well, if you can only imagine the public's reaction to James Child changing his surname to Wright, and he's now called Mr. Wright, and he still gets everything wrong. So I decided that probably wasn't the best way to go.